is Matt Kruger from the Daily News here in Studio 585. A week ago today, George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, died at the age of 94. And this past Wednesday, the country honored him with a National Day of Mourning. And here in studio to talk about the man's legacy is his former speechwriter, Caledonia native and author, Curt Smith. Curt, thank you for joining us today.
Well, Matt, thank you very much. It's great to be here, even under a very difficult last week. But always great to be in Batavia and to be with my good friends with the Daily News.
I'm sure it was. Well, let's start with the funeral service that was held this past Wednesday. You were there.
I was.
Can you take us inside, maybe give us your reaction and what we didn't see on the broadcast?
Well, my wife, Sarah, and I drove down to Pennsylvania on Tuesday and drove back after the memorial service. It was held at National Cathedral, which is an extraordinarily large and gracious cathedral, and it was packed with about 1,500 people. I think it was an exceedingly poignant service, particularly for those of us who had worked with and or known George Bush over the last, in my case, almost 30 years. And the Protestant hymns, of course, that soared one after another, which had been specifically chosen by George Bush, Rock of Ages and A Mighty Fortress is Our God, that are so familiar to so many Americans. The scripture readings itself, the marvelous, not sermons necessarily, but eulogies, particularly by Bush's son, who gave it his best and gave a marvelous eulogy, broke down at the end so memorably. It was a marvelous, I think, a tribute to really someone who was an all-American kid who lived an all-American life. I always felt of George Bush as Andy Hardy by way of Tom Mix, and the last great president of the greatest generation. And in honoring him, we honor really, I think, the great generation which defeated the Depression, which defeated the Nazis in the Second World War, and to whom we owe such an enormous bequest.
Well, how closely did you work with him as one of his speech writers? Because we see on shows like The West Wing and Designated Survivor that it's day in, day out. We're standing right next to the president. Is that accurate?
No,
or how
no,
close?
not in the White House is it accurate, because the president has other things to do except prepare speeches. But what happens, in answer to your question, I work closely with him in the sense of having written more speeches for him than anyone during the 4 years in the White House. But what happens is that you're assigned a speech, and then often you talk with the president, sometimes in person, often by phone, by email, by Pony Express, any way that you need to get some idea of what he wants to say. After a while, you know basically what he wants to say, and also how he wants to say it, in what prose style he likes, who he wants to quote, what kind of humor he wants to use. There's an Indian expression, American Indian: you don't get to know someone until you stand in his own moccasins. And that's the great challenge for a speechwriter, to speak as he would speak, the principle, not as you would speak. But with Bush, that was relatively easy because I could follow him, listen to audio, to video, and in time we became a friend, not simply a business employer. And so over 4 years, I worked with him very closely, as a speechwriter could. Then after we left the White House, prematurely I might add, after one term, but he, I knew, was going to be writing speeches to raise money for his library. So I volunteered to head a speech staff to help him do so on a volunteer basis. And over the next 4 to 5 years, got to know him far better in a personal setting than I ever did as a lowly speechwriter when he was busy running the free world. And so I went up to Kennebunkport, Maine, and down to Houston, Texas, home city, incidentally, of my wife, under the rubric of small world, and went to his home, talked to him by telephone, really got to know him in a personal way to a far greater extent. And really, up until about 5 years ago, I was writing speeches for him even then. So this is a 2-decade to quarter-century relationship for me, and it is a void that I feel, particularly right now.
Can you tell us about George Bush, the man, as opposed to George Bush, the president that we all got to see on TV?
Well, I'm a jaundiced viewer, but this would be echoed by anyone who knew George Bush. He was the best. as a human being. I'm not talking politics or ideology or even performance, although I think history will judge him a great president, particularly in foreign policy. As a human being, I don't know how you could improve. He was extraordinarily kind, he was gracious, he was courteous, he was modest. There's the great story about how at age 8 or 9, he loved baseball, as I did and do, and so many Americans do. And at age 8 or 9, he hit 2 home runs, and he came home to tell his mother, Mother Dorothy, who was the disciplinarian in the family. And she listened to what he had to say, and then she said, using the references and the lyrics from the hymn, she said, "Now, George, none of this how great thou art business." She brought him down to earth with a slammer, and he became an exceedingly modest person. In fact, he hated using the word I. You try using a speech or writing a speech without using the word I. You know, the Victorian we became in vogue. But he always steered the conversation to a visitor. And he had better manners than mismanners. And he had so much to teach us in that sort of way. You heard the encomiums this week. You heard the praise for him. It was all true. Nobody made it up from both parties. And you know, in this age where the left is fighting the right and the Republicans are fighting the Democrats, and we have this terribly acidic kind of atmosphere, which I hate, and I think most Americans hate. We have to do better. George Bush showed us how to do better. Now it's up to us.
Well, I think that ties in. 4 years ago, you published your book. It's George H.W. Bush, Character to the Core. You chose to focus your book on the man's character.
Yeah.
Why?
Because his character shone like a light bulb in the dark, and it always did. He talked about honor. Honor meant everything to him. He was brought up in not a Victorian necessarily, but a greatest generation old age home, where your word was your bond. You never lied. You were taught not to do that. He was a deeply religious person. Those hymns that you heard this week, they were no mistake. There was one after another. They rolled out at the National Cathedral and then at his service down in Houston. And of course, the military was involved with it to such a great extent, and military hymns and the Navy hymns. And he was a person that deeply revered the military, or of course, your word is always your bond. So between a faith in the man upstairs and your faith in the military, he was a patriot. He believed deeply in the United States of America. He was a war hero. Mm-hmm. The day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was a Sunday. The next day, he went to the draft board, and he tried to enlist, and the board said, "Sonny, you're too young. Come back when you're 18." He did. He enlisted at 18. He became the Navy's youngest aviator. He almost died 2 years later. He almost lost his life at 20. And 2 crewmates of his died. And he always felt unfairly to the end of his life that he was responsible. That's why he began skydiving at age 75 and 85 and 90 even. He needed a little help, but he was still skydiving. It was, he said, to try to pay homage to honor his crewmates. What a man. I mean, who would do that? Except really, as was said this week by John Roberts of Fox, an American hero. He was an American hero.
You mentioned before the acidity that we see in Washington now and in politics, but could you take us inside the Bush White House? What was it like? What was the atmosphere at that time?
It was very collegial because Bush demanded it so. Leadership, the atmosphere of a White House always takes its tenor from the top. Bush would never have tolerated a White House where you had this kind of back and forth and one person fighting another. We didn't have that. We had a White House that was collegial, where teamwork was respected, where, for example, speeches were assigned to 1 of 5 people. You worked directly with the boss, the old man, as we called him. That's almost always the appellation, the old man, except if you're like Barack Obama, I suppose, in your 40s. And, there was no back and forth, backbiting, this kind of thing, because Bush didn't think that that was proper. He had great respect for the presidency, for the office of the presidency. He didn't do anything, wouldn't tolerate the thought of besmirching that office. He had a reverence for the office and a reverence for the country, for the institutions of the country. You name it, the military, the presidency, the churches of the country. And the thought of him dishonoring them was hateful to him. And therefore, it was hateful to us. You always take your lead from the top.
What do you think was his greatest accomplishment?
Greatest accomplishment, I think, was in foreign policy. And I don't mean simply the Gulf War, which people think of in terms of his monumental achievement in 1991, a great military victory. But his handling of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire in 1991, the reunification of Germany, the bringing of freedom to hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, communism dissolving, it all happened under Bush's watch. And you have heard this week from Mikhail Gorbachev, from officials in Germany, from officials in Romania, the other countries in Europe, that this would not have happened. The Soviet Union would not have peacefully agreed to basically dissolve itself, to take a dagger and kill itself, had it not been for George Bush. He was able to use his skillful diplomacy. After all, he was one of the great diplomats of the past century, to facilitate and tell the Soviets, look, this is something you must do and something you can do. Peacefully dissolve. Don't go down with flames burning in the night, but do so peacefully. And they did, because they trusted him. That is his greatest accomplishment.
Conversely, what is his greatest error?
Greatest error, I think, was trusting the Democrats in terms of when he agreed to raise taxes and therefore violate his no new taxes pledge from the 1988 campaign. The Democratic leadership had promised him that if he agreed to raise taxes, they would agree to cut spending. They didn't cut spending. Democrats never cut spending, and he thought that they would, because they had given their word. He kept his word. They didn't keep their word. He was too trusting in this case, and it cost him. It cost him in terms of the perception of him, even though what he did helped to lower the deficit and therefore lower interest rates and therefore help the economy boom. The irony is the last quarter of the 1992 calendar year, which was the election year, the economy boomed at 4.2% economic growth, but not enough to save us during the 1992 election. He was not as good a politician as he was a president. But you know something? I think the ultimate referendum was held this week. Americans came in the end to see what kind of person and president George Bush was.
Well, I will leave you off with one question, but it's a big one.
Yeah.
What do you think is his legacy?
Legacy is he was a peacemaker. Legacy is he was, I think, in many ways, the greatest human being ever to occupy the Oval Office.
All right. Those are big words.
Well, in America, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but
Sure.
I think my opinion would be shared by a great many people.
All right. Well, with Curt Smith, this is Matt Kruger from the Daily News. Have a good day. Curt, thanks very much for joining
Thank you.
us today.
I appreciate it. You bet.
It was
Thank you.
excellent.